But fundamentally, I mean, anyone who's got a problem with my work can pick a number, get in line, and come say hello. I mean, I'm not really scared by. I don't know. I'm not really bothered by these people. They're not particularly threatening to me. They seem to take pleasure in being violent against young girls. I don't think they have the minerals to be violent against men, and yeah, that makes me feel safe.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. I thank you very much for your company. Now, folks, if you enjoy today's content, please do consider hitting that little subscribe button and the notification bell that sits next to it. And if you're in a position to actually support our independent journalism, then please do hit the link in the description where you'll be taken to offer your support. I thank you indeed from the bottom of my heart. Now, folks, on today's show, I'm delighted to say that our guest this week is Charlie Peters. Now, for those that don't know Charlie, or who haven't seen his fantastic documentary for GB News, it's called Grooming Gang's Britain's Shame. Charlie is a reporter and a presenter for GB News Investigates. Now, that's GB News's investigative wing. That's quite a mouthful. Now, what I love most about Charlie's work for GB News is that he's actually out there covering some of the stories that matter to most of you out there in Britain, but stories that crucially, and I say this, it really is crucial, stories that receive precious little attention across much of our established media. So Charlie joins me now. Charlie, thank you very much for your time.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Darren.
Charlie, before we get into some of the exclusive stories that you've managed to actually break with GB News, especially around the Grooming Gang scandal in Britain, I want to actually start by asking you what motivated you personally to want to look into this. You know, why were you passionate enough about the whole scandal that took place in Britain that, frankly, survivors and former officials are rightly saying is a stain upon the nation?
Well, I felt fundamentally that we never had the sufficient national conversation that this issue deserved. I mean, when Andrew Norfolk at the Times blew the lid off the scandal in 2012, great attention was paid to the issue, but it was insufficient. We had government reports revealing the situation in Rotherham. We then had the National Crime Agency come in to do more work there. But the rest of the conversation just kind of disappeared after that. And so many dozens of other towns have had this scourge affect them. And I felt like the conversation surrounding the issue was lacking severely. So I wanted to re-enter this issue with some fresh thinking, some fresh analysis, and also to see whether there had been more developments. I wanted to check if there had been stories from survivors that had been missed, and if there had been accountability that had been failed to deliver. And well, I found plenty of both.
Yeah, and indeed you have. Because, I mean, this week, and we're just talking about this week, there have been other stories that you've broken, but this week you had an exclusive for GB News on a survivor of a grooming gang abuser who managed to actually sue said abuser for £425,000. Can you tell us a little bit more about this particular example, why it's such a landmark case, and crucially why the victim in question felt the need to do this, to actually away from the courts, and well, it was through the courts, but away from the court in that specific example of putting this bloke in prison, why she felt that doing a civil suit was actually a route for her.
It's an icebreaker case. It's like the first really positive story we've had in this issue in ages, and I,
Yeah.
I genuinely have been smiling about it all week because I've known Liz, this survivor, for nearly a couple of years now. We've worked together, and I've seen her go through this legal process. And when the court judgment came through, it was like, with all the misery that the story has had, to have someone take their abuser to the cleaners for 425 grand. I mean, finally. The reason why it's been described as an icebreaker is because now there are thousands of other survivors around the country. Hundreds of abusers have been convicted, and they might be able to do the same. And it's not about the money. It's about the ability to deliver justice in the civil courts, where it has been lacking in the criminal courts. So many of these abusers get minuscule prison sentences, often go to open prison, are out within 2 or 3 years,
Mm.
returning to their communities with no community punishment, back to their jobs, back to their homes, and their abusers and the perpetrators and the survivors bump into each other in the street. in the supermarket. It's a perverse situation. But
It
by suing her abuser, Liz has developed a situation whereby he will have to sell his house. He will be penniless. He will be distraught. This is the justice that she never received on a plate.
Absolutely, but why do you think it's been the case that the justice hasn't been behind the survivors of this horrible atrocity, frankly?
Well, it's been soft touch Britain is the simple answer. We have a tiny prison population. We don't have the prison estate required to house many of these people. The punishments are insufficient. Often the prosecution has been delayed by decades in some of these cases. I mean, Liz was abused between 2002 and 2004, but the National Crime Agency was brought in and only secured this conviction in 2018. So it was a huge delay
Wow.
to be delivered. In so many of these cases, it's hard to get the evidence after so long. The police failed in so many cases. And one example I'll use of the many thousands. In Rochdale, they had a fetus from an abortion in a police freezer, and they didn't use it for evidence to charge a man with rape. I mean, it was unbearable incompetence at the top to the bottom of these police forces. And I think the CPS fumbled the bag. Sir Keir Starmer said we let down a generation of girls when he was chief of the prosecution service. It's clear that every level of society and government and state that is sworn to protect these girls and defend them and deliver them justice, they have failed. And the civil courts give them an opportunity to secure what others have not delivered.
Yeah, because I mean, you mentioned that Sir Keir Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions. I mean, I think the Labour Party, frankly, have got a lot to answer for here, because it strikes me that whilst this is a really good and heartwarming example of a victory for, and I'm delighted for Liz, it has to be said, but I find it utterly baffling and frankly I'm going to say unforgivable that for decades, you know, this abuse was just sort of swept under the carpet, like, oh god, no, we can't talk about that, you know, like it's some really bad horrible secret, when actually if sunlight is the best disinfectant, we needed a hell of a lot of sunlight to protect these vulnerable young women. And I actually, not even young women in some cases, Charlie, girls, right? Let's call them what they are, girls.
12, 10, prepubescent girls, girls with a whole life ahead of them. Childhood was what they were experiencing, and childhood was what was stolen from them. And you're right. I mean, as I said in the beginning, I mean, searching for accountability and whether or not it had been delivered was a key part of this mission. And in the other stories that I've run on GB News on this issue, we found that a former councillor who was forced to resign during the scandal in Rotherham was selected by the Labour Party to stand for Parliament. Well, I mean, thankfully, I think Sir Keir reversed that decision after our report. And then a few weeks later, we uncovered that another former councillor from Rotherham, also named in the KC report into Rotherham Borough Council during this horrifying sex abuse scandal, was working as an NHS diversity manager. Okay, like an unbelievable situation. He managed to reinvent himself as a sort of anti-racist activist, having once been a community cohesion minister involved in preventing sufficient investigation into rape gangs. Now given a public sector salary, a very nice public sector salary, by the way, 49 grand if you're interested.
Yeah, not
And
bad.
yeah, not bad at all, especially where he's living in West Midlands. I mean, that goes far around there. And so with this extraordinary situation, accountability lacking still 7 years on, I think a lot of survivors deeply distressed by that situation.
Yeah, because you mentioned there the candidate for Rother Valley, that I think your work expose through GB News has really, you know, you shone a light on the fact that this bloke, you know, was there at the time when actually that just goes to the heart, doesn't it, Charlie, about the precious little amount of accountability for the people that didn't do enough. When
Yeah.
by didn't do enough, that is the grand understatement of the time, because they didn't, it seems to me, they didn't do sod all, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, the stories from that period are really horrifying. I mean, Labour Party members who are trying to raise concerns were subject to false allegations of racism. When the police tried to finally launch operations looking at taxi drivers in Rotherham, they were dissuaded from doing so by ministers who thought that that was a racist endeavor. I mean, just like obscene levels of cover up. The police were, I would say, complicit in the abuse in South Yorkshire, especially in Rotherham, where they told girls that they were making a lifestyle choice, that their abusers were a fashion accessory to have an Asian boyfriend. I mean, the examples are listless. There are thousands of terrible examples. If I go through all of them, we'll be here for hours, sadly. But your viewers can check out the film Grooming Gangs, Britain Shame for more details of just how badly they were. And you know what? In making the film, it was really hard to pick examples of failure because we had hundreds to choose from, and narrowing down the most visceral and the most human failures was extremely difficult. But I think you'll agree that the ones we picked do tell a very horrifying story whereby so-called community cohesion was prioritized over the safety and security of these young girls, and those who are involved in it have completely escaped punishment. I'm not talking about perpetrators here. I'm talking about police officers not being fired, talking about councillors leaving and getting different jobs in the public sector, I'm talking about councillors even staying on and, ignoring issues in 2005. And there's one Labour councillor who's now director of ethics at Rotherham Council, and she ignored warnings about this issue in '05. This has been allowed to happen because a wider national conversation and media focus on this issue just hasn't happened. And we should all be very grateful to GB News for having the minerals to let us do this work.
I completely agree, and of course I will put a link in the description to Grooming Gangs, Britain Shame, which I urge everyone to watch, because actually I felt sick to the pit of my stomach and really upset and quite angry when I watched it. But I mean, there was a quote in it, if I remember correctly, and it's by Margaret Oliver, who is a former detective constable. Where was she a detective constable at, Charlie?
Maggie was
Maggie
DC.
Oliver.
Maggie Oliver was a DC in the Rochdale section of Greater Manchester Police.
And she says something like, it seems to me that they just made a judgment that these children didn't matter, right? And I mean, the J report says, 1,400 girls in Rotherham alone? I mean...
That's right.
When you look at the sheer number,
the number was revised upwards to 1,510.
Wow. I mean, it's incredibly hard to actually, visualize the sheer scale of the extent to which these organized gangs actually operated, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And the numbers fundamentally don't add up in terms of the number of survivors that we know about and the number of perpetrators that we've caught. I mean, there is a ginormous gap between convictions and testimony of survivors, legitimate testimony confirmed by social workers, police, and the NCA and other government officials. This is a grave failure that there is such a gap. And I think it's petrifying to think that across the country, we collated up to 50 different towns and cities where there are credible reports of these grooming gangs operating in the last 20 years. It's petrifying to think about how many of those towns will have how many perpetrators, we just don't know, still roaming, still having the freedom to operate, because when the opportunity was there to snatch them, we bottled it.
Well, then on that point, many people, and I've seen some of the commentators actually, whenever I shared your work, for example, or any work on the topic itself, investigation work on what went on, you are smeared as talking about right-wing talking points, right, Charlie? You're smeared as being some kind of you are seeking to stir the pot, that you are seeking to undo racial cohesion in Britain and all the rest of it. But when you look at, you've got Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, Oxford even, and other towns and cities. Is it the case, Charlie, that in trying to smear anyone that does the kind of work that you're doing as being some kind of extremist, that we actually end up allowing this to go on today at this very moment, right? Where we actually know that this sort of scandal can happen again.
Yes, and the product of our investigation into the grooming gang scandal and working with the Maggie Oliver Foundation was very much that we found it is still going on today. There are thousands of girls who still are being fobbed off by the police and by social services and the local council. And there are dozens of active cases that the Maggie Oliver Foundation is managing right now, live cases across the country. And those are just survivors who've come forward to Maggie. I mean, that is a and her team. That is a tiny charity, just a handful of workers. So the wider national picture, we just don't know. And you know what? I'm cautiously optimistic that I think in the very near future something might change here, and that there will be a renewed national effort to deal with this issue, because I think the findings that we've produced and the reinvigoration of this issue in the media, even if others have not picked up on it and many outlets have kind of ignored our findings, I still think that that has allowed many people in policy and indeed in the levers of power to think, okay, maybe something's going on here. Maybe actually there is a space for us to achieve things here. And I make several policy recommendations in the film, which some people might think is quite strange, but I don't shy away from being an outcomes focused journalist when it comes to these kind of issues. Right? You might find it twee and cringe to say it, but I mean, I want to make a difference when you make this kind of stuff, right? When you speak to these survivors, it's very hard not to want to have an influence in how this actually changes and how you fix these issues. But yeah, like I said, cautious optimism. It's long overdue.
Well, indeed it is. I mean, I read in the Mail, unrelated, but actually not unrelated. I think these things are all linked. I read in the Mail that a few weeks ago they reported, Charlie, that the Batley Grammar School teacher that went into hiding, viewers will remember, went into hiding after showing a cartoon to his school kids of the Prophet Muhammad. Now he's still in hiding. That occurred in March of 2021 in West Yorkshire. And I don't know about you, but I find the lack of a robust defence for this teacher to be troubling indeed, as well as the threats, let's not forget, more recently made to the kid who apparently slightly scuffed a copy of the Quran in a Wakefield school. Now, it doesn't suggest to me that our willingness to actually speak up is actually there. We seem to be still held back by a fear of being accused of racism or even threats to your life and certainly your livelihood.
Yeah, I think, well, the media that you and I work with have been pretty honest and straightforward on this issue, which is reassuring. So I think there's been a bit of a vibe shift in that space. And I think at the national level, national government was pretty strong. Suella Braverman issued pretty strong statements on both of these issues. What really causes these problems to happen? And you know, Batley and Wakefield are a 19, 20-minute drive away from each other, like 10 miles, 12 miles away. I mean, they're very close. And they have the same authorities that deal with them. You know, West Yorkshire Police deal with both of them. The real problem with these places and with the failure to respond robustly to threats of violence against children due to some sort of like fake religious law is local authorities having unbelievable levels of cowardice and lacking the sufficient level of integrity and values and standards required to deliver the law appropriately, fairly, and robustly for all. So if we want to know why this is still happening, look to the kind of hopeless and corrupt police forces that deal with these issues. Now, Maruf Hussain, that NHS diversity manager that I mentioned a moment ago, who we kind of stung in January, he was actually giving West Yorkshire Police anti-Islamophobia training and talks to a superintendent in 2017, just 2 years after being forced to resign from Rotherham Borough Council. So there is a whole kind of like diversity, charity, blobby mix-up with the police where they invite these speakers and talkers to promote, frankly, ludicrous far-left politics, which then our public sector and our public services that you and I pay a very pretty penny for lap up and use in their policy. And what is the product of that? Teachers in hiding, school kids threatening with receiving death threats for playground games. I mean, it's obscene. And you'd think after all of this, perhaps lessons would be learned. You'd cull these like diversity talks and these influences in our politics, but I mean, lessons don't seem to be learned, or the pressure against them is so high that we just have to put up with it.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, anecdotally, Charlie, I was in Batley when the by-election was held, in which the late Joe Cox, who was horribly murdered in that constituency, her sister won the by-election, but George Galloway was campaigning in that seat, and I was there and I looked at some of the election material, Charlie, and it was some of the most horrific race baiting, frankly, that I've ever seen. And
Yeah.
the divisions, the fissures in constituencies like that one, I think are pretty evident.
Oh yeah.
And I
Yeah.
just don't like the direction that we're heading in, Charlie. I probably this will probably be clipped now, and I'll be called all sorts. But I'm sorry. We are in Britain a very tolerant nation, but we're not going to be divided around lines of a religious cult. Frankly,
Well, we are. We are. I mean, we are. We have, due to, I mean, this is all opinion, but I think it stacks up. Due to, like, frankly, insane immigration policies, we've ended up with a situation across the country whereby we've imported various regional, inter-ethnic,
yeah,
inter-religious quarrels from around the world and watched them play out on the streets of Britain. I mean, a crazy example of this that I always refer to is the Bangladeshi Liberation War of the 1970s. In that war, rape was a common weapon. So hundreds of thousands were raped, and there are regular protests and like moments of solidarity held by victims in Bangladesh and the wider diaspora around the world to remember that conflict and survivors from it. So you end up in a situation due to our migration policies whereby survivors and victims from the Bangladeshi Liberation War live among perpetrators from the same conflict in Britain. Like we have two groups who once fought each other just living alongside each other. And that is a small example, but it's indicative of a wider problem we have in these places whereby we are witnessing regional foreign quarrelling for problems that aren't our own, that aren't
yeah,
our own people. Like when you think about the problems in Iran last year, people like protesting, violent protests in the streets of London against the Iranian theocracy. I mean, that is not my problem. I mean,
no,
that we should not have violence in the streets of London between pro-Iranian and anti-Iranian groups who, for some reason, are carrying out their squabbles, serious as they may be, in Notting Hill and beyond. Like, that should not happen.
hmm
And the same is true when it comes to a clash between communities in West Yorkshire, be they white British or South Asian. This should not happen in Britain.
Charlie, I wonder when you've, for hours and hours of filming, no doubt, because obviously you had to be selective in the footage that actually made it to the final film on the Groom Gangs documentary that you did. What were the backgrounds of many of the girls, or now women, that you spoke to? Because what's patently obvious to me is that these girls ought to have been in the kind of people that you would think that the Labour Party in constituencies that are, ex-industrial,
Mhm.
ex-mining, the Labour Party have had strong electoral bases there for many years, if not their entire existence. And instead, the MPs seem more arsed about membership of the EU or in allowing kids to chop their breasts off after watching a TikTok video. So I'm wondering, what do you actually think were the backgrounds of these women, one? And secondly, why do they just not matter to the political class? That's when I find it so bloody hard to comprehend. And maybe I'm just naive, maybe I'm sort of utopian, but
Mhm.
you would think that these politicians would care more about
Well, yeah,
these girls than the bloody EU or whatever else, you know?
I don't think it's utopian to have the wish that you have there. I think it should be pretty basic for all of us, but unfortunately, it isn't for some. And there's not been any sufficient study, I don't think, on the background of perpetrators or survivors. The ethnicity on it all and the background data and the socio-cultural data is lacking because we haven't paid sufficient attention to this issue at government level. So it's hard to extrapolate very accurately across the nation because, again, there are so many stories we haven't heard. But what we do know, based on the reporting and based on the reports that we have, the J report, the Casey report, the Crowther report in Telford, reports from the GMCA in Manchester, is that they are overwhelmingly white working class girls who were overwhelmingly considered underclass and unworthy of attention by those who were sworn to
Well,
protect them.
absolutely, and I mean, I don't want to offend any viewers, so I am about to swear. So if that offends you, put fingers in your ears. But they were dismissed as being white slags and things
There are
like
many
that. I
cases.
mean, the most disgusting language.
And the language used by perpetrators was not entirely dissimilar to the language used by those sworn to protect them. I mean, that is the saddest thing, actually, I think, with all the stories I've heard from people I've met, and that often it's so easy to not quite entirely forget what you're listening to when they tell you who said what. Because you think, wait, was that a police officer who said you were unworthy, or was that an abuser who said you were unworthy? Because because you just lose track, because there's so many, they have heard so many appalling things during their experiences. The fear now is that with so few punishments and levels of accountability in the police and social services, and people leaving councils after failing and working in charities or whatever, that the culture still remains. And a lot of these places will send you statements and say, oh, Ofsted now rank our services as good, and we're moving in the right direction. But if you've still got people who were around at the time working in the public sector still, how good can it really be? I mean, I just think the reckoning hasn't been there when it's so obviously needed to be.
And Charlie, I mean, I was watching, don't tell my employer, but I shouldn't admit this, I was watching Piers Morgan, and he was interviewing Richard Dawkins. Now, Richard is obviously, he's spoken against, I guess, theocrats and religious zealots and pious people for goodness only knows how long. He's a grand old age now. And Charlie, in this clip with Piers Morgan, Richard implied that he feared for his life in speaking out about certain issues.
Right.
Now, I'm wondering, do you ever think, well, bloody hell, I'm speaking about issues where maybe I should be slightly scared myself about speaking out?
Well, I mean, of course, at some degree. I mean, I imagine that Maruf Hussein doesn't particularly like me very much after I've, got him sacked and all the rest of it. But spending time put him under investigation for now. We'll see. Well, when I've spent time in some of these places, there has been a threatening aura. There's no doubt about it. When I was in Glodick in Oldham, I mean, I wasn't welcome. I certainly stood out. And when I was in Telford as well, there were people following us all the time. And I had a very small team for this film, and I kept it that way because actually I wanted to be able to keep everyone safe. And it's harder to keep people safe if there are, 5 different people running around without your oversight. But fundamentally, I mean, anyone who's got a problem with my work can pick a number, get in line, and come say hello. I mean, I'm not really scared by, I don't know, I'm not really bothered by these people. They're not particularly threatening to me. They seem to take pleasure in being violent against young girls. I don't think they have the minerals to be violent against men. And, that makes me feel safe.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to go back to what you said earlier there, which was about your optimism around all of this. And actually what we've discussed and what we've said so far, Charlie, it's probably not painted a very optimistic picture. So no. I sort of want to end our discussion on a note of if there can be any semblance of optimism around this. Is there? Because I don't feel very optimistic.
The 2 big optimistic points. Number 1, Liz and her huge
God
legal win.
bless Liz.
And the dozens more survivors who I know are now considering similar legal action, and the many, many solicitors who are gearing up after her win. And 2, I have some confidence, cautious confidence, but confidence nonetheless, that we may see action soon, and we should watch this space.
Well, and you'll be there to report it, Charlie, I've no doubt. Charlie Peters, thank you very much for your time. As I say, I'm going to put a link to the fantastic documentary in the description there so you can check it out. But Charlie, where are you at on Twitter if people want to seek you out?
I'm at CDP 1882, the birth year of James Joyce and Tottenham Hotspur. And
well, there we are. What more could a boy ask for? Charlie, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have you got what it takes to be a reasoned presenter? Well, send us a short clip of yourself to join@reasoned.uk and we might be seeing you on this very channel very soon indeed.